Now I can breathe.
Yeah, well, that was a very interesting list, and nothing that was really expected, except maybe Jane Eyre. That's a very, very popular book. But the rest of them are all things, well, I've heard of Neuromancer. The rest of them are all books I've never heard of before.
Oh, good.
So that's a very interesting list. My list is a little more conventional, stuff that most people are probably going to have heard of before. So where do I start it off? I'll start it off with the number one, and well, I could probably put everything in this book. It's an omnibus volume of the science fiction novels of H.G. Wells, but probably the best is The Time Machine. His first novel, and always the most fascinating to me, mainly because of all the different science fiction subjects that come out of that novel and his later writings also. If you read H.G. Wells, he basically wrote every different type of science fiction story before everybody else did. And everybody else has just been kind of rewriting what he did back then. So, and the Time Machine in particular just involves so many different subjects of invention and history and politics, evolution, so many, it works on so many different levels if you really get into it. It's a fascinating book, and nobody was writing anything on that level of scientific imagination at the time that book was written. The second one, I think I'm going to say, this is another omnibus book, but mostly I'm pointing out the Foundation Trilogy by Isaac Asimov. Another of the earliest books that I read, and one of the earliest of my introduction to science fiction, and some of the books that got me into science fiction after H.G. Wells. Asimov was basically rewriting the fall of the Roman Empire set in a galactic empire. That was his basic idea that he used to start writing these stories. And they were originally published over like a 12-year period, mostly in Astounding Stories in the 1940s as novelettes that were all connected. So they were written over a long period of time, but putting them together into the books, I think, worked out really well. You have this very cohesive story, and yet it was written over such a long period of time in so many different pieces. It's pretty amazing. And of course, the Foundation has gone on to be very influential over a lot of newer science fiction writers, and it's even influenced the entire Al-Qaeda movement, really, which I learned only a couple of years ago that they based what they wanted to do off of reading the first publications of the Foundation Trilogy in Arabic back in the early 1980s. It's crazy, and especially since Asimov was definitely a pacifist. I think if he were alive today and would hear that, he would be extremely troubled that people would take his work and use it for something so terrible. Asimov did not believe in war. He believed in peace. He did not believe in what's the word I'm looking? He did not believe in any kind of prejudice against peoples. He was one of the few men that stood up in the 1970s in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment and women's rights at that time. And so his character is just so totally against everything that Al-Qaeda stands for, that to find out that they used his science fiction stories as their model for how to bring down big governments is extremely disturbing, but makes his books all the more important to our history and our reality. They're no longer just fun galactic empire space opera books like they were when I first read them in the late 1970s. They are now an integral part of our real history and have influenced how events have occurred in our own world. So very important books.
I'm not at all familiar with his work. Now I want to be.
Well,
That's why we're doing this.
he's an interesting writer. He really wanted he really was interested in writing mystery stories.
Okay.
So all of his stories, especially the robot stories that he wrote, are mysteries.
Oh, okay.
But they're mysteries about science. That's kind of how he approached science fiction. Is he posed a scientific situation that was causing people to not know what's going on, and they had to apply science to solve the mystery of what was happening. And so by the end of the
That's
story,
cool.
you had a scientific solution to the mystery. But yeah, very much. He even wrote a whole series of mystery stories called Tales of the Black Widowers, and so his writing is it's less adventure, less space battles and stuff, and more about people talking to one another and coming to solutions to situations. The Foundation trilogy has yet to be filmed because if you remain true to Asimov's books, it's just people sitting around talking about the events that are going on around the whole galactic empire. He's never actually in the action. It's always after the fact, people hearing
Like the
about it and talking about the
synopsis.
implications of it and
Okay.
trying to figure out where the future history of the galactic empire is going to go according to the psychohistory principles set down by a guy named Harry Seldon.
Okay.
Fascinating stuff, but definitely very different from any other science fiction you're going to read,
Okay.
including this one.
That one's really
Another-
colorful. I'm like, ooh, pretty colors.
Yeah, I love
Great,
the artist
great book
Stanislav
cover.
Fernandez did covers to all of Arthur Clarke's
Oh,
books
that's
in the
awesome.
late 1970s.
Really cool.
And beautiful airbrushed illustrations. But the book is Childhood's End. And I debated whether to put this one or 2001: A Space Odyssey on my list, but I think Childhood's End had a much bigger impact on me because number one, it's not just a novelization of a movie. Number two, the ideas in it, this was written in the early 1950s, the ideas in this book are a lot of what led to 2001: A Space Odyssey. So this is the beginnings of Clarke's whole kind of science fictional worldview, if you will. I don't know if he really believed what he was writing or if he was just writing fun stories, but it's fascinating the way Clarke is always thinking about how man will evolve into the future. And the book itself is literally about mankind's childhood coming to an end and evolving into the next stage. And it's a brilliant, big novel with just some mind-blowing ideas. It's a great story. Next, I'll go to H.P. Lovecraft.
Woo! Oh,
No, you can do it. Sure.
Woo!
Tell you what.
Love it.
This book is one I got trying to think where I actually was introduced to Lovecraft, because I didn't buy this until after I had read something by Lovecraft, but I can't for the life of me think where I first read him. But this was the first book I bought. This one was published by Arkham House. I think they still have this edition available, not with this cover though. But Arkham House, of course, is the publisher in Wisconsin that was founded by August Derleth, a fellow writer and a good friend of Lovecraft. He started the publishing business just to keep Lovecraft's books in print after he died, because he was, at that time, nobody knew who he was. And even when I bought this in the 70s, he wasn't all that well known yet. Today, everybody knows H.P. Lovecraft, but back then, he wasn't well known. And especially, so the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, he was only in print by Arkham House.
That's interesting. That's
And
really cool.
Yeah, and so this book, it's the best supernatural stories of H.P. Lovecraft, and has a lot of his best stories, like The Outsider, The Color Out of Space, which was just released as a cool movie, The Call of Cthulhu, which we're going to review, The Dunwich Horror, Shadow over Innsmouth, The Shadow Out of Time. They're all in this one book. And Lovecraft revolutionized horror stories. Nothing quite like his fiction had been written before his time. Before Lovecraft, horror was mostly a matter of atmosphere, and there weren't any real monsters or any real horrors going on. It was mostly implied. Lovecraft was the first one that brought the monsters out of the darkness and started describing all these weird creatures and the whole mythology behind all these creatures that he was imagining. And he created the Cthulhu mythos to kind of string it all together. And of course, it's just brilliant. And everybody today is publishing Lovecraft books now.
I love how all Lovecraft's work, too, all happens in the same universe.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is no other universe. He writes very straight right through the same universe. So everything is interconnected, which is really awesome.
Mm-hmm. From there, this one's one that a lot of people haven't heard of and probably should. Alone Against Tomorrow by Harlan Ellison. And with Harlan Ellison, I could basically just grab any one of his books because he mostly wrote short stories. And so there are many, many different collections of his work. The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, Alone Against Tomorrow, Approaching Oblivion, Strange Wine, many collections, and they're all the same level of quality. And Ellison was one of those authors in the 1960s that wanted to bring science fiction into literature. He actually didn't want to be a science fiction writer, and he tried to get out of that science fiction ghetto because probably before Star Wars, definitely before Star Trek, science fiction was not taken seriously as writing. It was kid stuff. It was, teenage boys read it. It was all these weird space operas and monsters and parents even discouraged their kids from reading it because it was just too weird, too wild, and it wasn't literature. Nobody in the literature world took this stuff seriously. But in the 1950s, something interesting happened. A number of writers, including Ellison, they were excellent writers and they wanted to write more experimental fiction, but they couldn't get it published anywhere except science fiction magazines. So writers like Ellison, James Graham Ballard, Brian Aldiss, Michael Moorcock, that whole generation of writers from the late 1950s, early 1960s, they turned to science fiction magazines as a market for their work. Their work was more fantastic and surreal than science fiction, but it was brilliant and it was very literate, and the only place they could get it published was science fiction magazines. So they did. But Ellison did not want to be just a science fiction writer. He wanted to go beyond that. Even though a lot of his work is definitely fantasy, definitely science fiction, he was a science fiction fan originally. He did show up at all the science fiction conventions, and he did embrace fandom because they did like his work and did give him a way to publish, but he wanted to become bigger than that. He wanted to break out into the larger world of literature. And I think everybody in science fiction really wanted us science fiction fans to be taken more seriously and wanted our literature to be taken more seriously as literature. And I think it's people like Harlan Ellison, Ursula Le Guin, James Graham Ballard, they're the ones that broke through that wall and got science fiction to the level of respectability, where all of a sudden in the 1980s, you were going to colleges and seeing courses in the English department on science fiction, which was mind-blowing. That had never happened before. It was all of a sudden being taken seriously, but it's because of the quality of writers like Harlan Ellison. And Ellison, his fiction is different from everybody else's. He was always called the angry man of science fiction, and he wrote with that edge. He wanted to piss people off, and he did, constantly. And his fiction is not easy to read, but it's brilliant. It is deep, it is brilliant, it is great. And he only recently passed away. And so the world, and within a couple of years, losing Ellison, losing Le Guin,
I know.
within a couple of years, we've lost pretty
They're
much
taking
the
them from
last
us.
of our giants in the science fiction literature. But as of his death, I mean, he is taken more seriously, but he's still stuck in the science fiction world. And people need to start looking at the fact that, okay, science fiction is a nice way to market this kind of literature, but we need to go beyond that and start seeing this, start putting it next to Jane Eyre as literature. And just because it's imaginative and a little fantastic, that doesn't make it that much different. It's still great reading.
That had a really fun cover too. Lots of good colors, really interesting illustration.
Leo and Diane Dillon, they in the 60s and 70s they illustrated all of Ellison's works, because they were his favorite illustrators, so he would always try to force the publishers to use
I love
them.
when authors do that, when they find an artist that they really want to stick with. That's really cool.
Well, you often have an artist whose work does complement the writer's work really, really well. And that's what you have with Harlan Ellison and the Dillons. Their illustrations perfectly complemented what he was doing with his stories. So it was just a match made in heaven. And it is nice. And actually, another one from his generation, Samuel Delaney, he's still with us, but very old. He's been posting a lot on Facebook lately about just how crappy the covers to his books are. He's kind of tired of it, that the covers do not reflect what you're going to get in his books. And he's another very brilliant, very literate writer who helped us start getting taken seriously. And one of the books from before we were taken seriously, but which is now accepted by everyone as a classic of American literature, is Fahrenheit 451. This book, I didn't read it until I took a science fiction class in my senior year of high school. And I read it there. I had never read Bradbury before that time, and I read this book and was absolutely blown away by the issues, the presentation, the quality of the writing, the quality of the story. This is a brilliant book. It's high literature, but it's high literature that's still fun to read. It's enjoyable and it's cool, and just a lot of great things about this. And Bradbury is a very accessible writer who all of his fiction is very well written and worth checking out. Start with this one. Move on to Something Wicked This Way Comes, and The October Country, and Martian Chronicles, and The Illustrated Man. Definitely worth reading all of that.
Yeah, I hadn't read any of his stuff until I was in college, and I did it for pleasure reading because I'm like, I hear about him all the time. No, never had to read him in high school or anything, so really good work.
So the next one is one of the early literate science fiction writers. He started writing in 1939 for Astounding Stories. Started selling to John W. Campbell in the very early days of science fiction. But his stories, science fiction or fantasy, were different from everybody else's. Because while everybody else was writing, like Isaac Asimov, these scientific mysteries, what Campbell called the thought variant, where you have a scientific idea and you put your characters in the middle of it and have them try to figure out how to deal with it. Sturgeon wasn't writing that kind of story. He was writing more character-driven fiction in the 1940s and 1950s, and this is probably his most brilliant novel, More Than Human. This one, again, kind of like Clark, and actually published the same year as Childhood's End. More Than Human is about human evolution and where we're going. What you have in More Than Human, though, is you have three characters, a man and a woman and a child, that somehow come across one another, and their minds, because of who they are, their minds join together and they become more than human, because they're three minds together thinking as one, thinking as a team. And the story presents that as the next stage of human evolution. And it's a brilliant story, very, very mind-blowing book to read. So definitely one to check out, and really anything else by Theodore Sturgeon. Some of it's getting a little dated now, but because he wrote mostly in the 40s and 50s, but he was probably the first very literate science fiction writer. And next, I had to read this one in high school along with everybody else on the planet, To Kill a Mockingbird. And this and the movie of this are still, they blew me away, and they're still my very favorite stories. It probably the first non-science fiction story I read, and I was so much oriented towards science fiction. I didn't even read fantasy. I only read science fiction when I was a teenager. And so to hand me a book that there's no spaceships, no aliens, no robots running amok, what the heck kind of a book is this? So I had to force myself through it, and I found myself loving it and couldn't believe it. But it is a brilliant book, which I don't need to say anything more. Everybody knows the book. Everybody knows how important it is to our history and to the race relations that were going on at the time of the story and at the time the book was published, and how important those were to our entire history. So, as I said, when I was a teenager, I did not even read fantasy, only science fiction. I was this purist. It had to be about the future. It had to have spaceships. It had to have science.
You guys should see the gold leaf on the side of this one. It's beautiful.
I had a cousin who loved The Lord of the Rings. And when he found out I could do paintings, he wanted me to do a painting based on it. And I agreed, but I had never read anything fantasy. I didn't think I would like it. I thought I was going to hate it, and it's so damn big. But I forced myself through it because it was my cousin. He was asking nicely. My cousin Jeff Kirkman, he's a really good guy. And I thought, okay, I had to bite the bullet and push myself through this. And of course, I found myself enjoying it, which I didn't like at the time because it's not science fiction. Why? What the heck am I doing enjoying
Elves
fantasy?
are kind of like aliens when you think about it. I mean,
but I absolutely loved it. So after I was finished, I was actually reading my brother's paperback copies of The Lord of the Rings. I did go out and I bought this nice edition from, I believe I got it at B. Dalton Bookseller, which is no longer around anymore. And paid the money and just got it because I had to have it for my library collection. So my last one, which I read after all of those other books, which is weird because I should have read this very early on, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I waited until the late 1980s to read this. I always wanted to read it because, of course, I grew up loving the Boris Karloff movie. It's one of my favorite movies, and I always wanted to read the book, but I never dove in and read it until a long time later, late 1980s. I was in my early 20s, and I finally jumped in and read Frankenstein and was blown away. This, of course, is considered to be the first real science fiction novel. That's debated by some people because there's not really a lot of science in it, but it is based on kind of a mysterious scientific process, just doesn't go into much detail. But the book really, it isn't about the science. It's more about the human psyche and the two sides of our minds. And Dr. Frankenstein splits his into himself and another creation of his. They're really both sides of him. So it's more of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde story than about creating artificial life. But it's absolutely brilliant, of course. This is one of the greatest books ever written. So that's my list. And of course, those are presented in no particular order. It's not like the first one I show is the best and Frankenstein's the worst. And then there are so many other books that could be on this list. But to keep it down to just 10 each, there was stuff we had to kick out. Like I would love to have included Dune.
Yeah.
But I couldn't.
I almost did.
Yeah.
I almost did the whole series, and like that knocks out 3 favorites right there.
But when I thought about that one, I thought, okay, what book am I going to take away to put Dune in there? And I just couldn't. So I ended up leaving Dune off my list, and lots of other books like that could be on the list. And like I said, Harlan Ellison, trying to decide which one of his to put in. They're all as good. They're all absolutely brilliant. And then I have nothing by J.G. Ballard in this list. Ballard is one of the most brilliant science fiction authors. But to put him in and take any of the others out, I just couldn't do it. So he couldn't make the top 10 either. He's definitely top 20 books like The Drowned World or Crash or his collection Chronopolis and Other Stories. That was the first book of his that I read. Brilliant fiction, very surrealistic.